giving their talk on the National Trust Fabric.
Thank you all for coming. Before we get started, just a very brief survey to figure out the audience. I see a lot of my peers here from the Security Special Interest Group of CUCCIO. So this talk is actually a product of dialogue that's going on between security professionals that service the university domain. But how many people here are in the risk auditing business at your universities? Just put up your hands. Okay, how many CIOs are here? A couple of CIOs. What about partners not directly related to the universities, but who support the community, such as CANARIE, Grid.ca, so other partners involved with research? Okay, so we have some of our research partners. This talk is a part of an emerging discussion that's going on about building enterprise architecture at a national level. I'm Jeff Gardner. I'm the CISO for Western University.
And I'm Lawrence Dobransky, and Director of ICT Security at the University of Saskatchewan.
So the purpose of this talk is really to break out of our security silo, to engage partners who are also interested in this, and to share insights that we have as security professionals.
So we're really trying to get a business awareness out there along this issue.
Okay, so I'll be speaking primarily about trust, and Lawrence?
We'll be talking about assurance.
And they're related. Because this is part of a larger dialogue, I have to tip my hat to CUCCIO, who's engaged in this. CANARIE, is there anyone from CANARIE here? A couple of guys from CANARIE. Obviously Western, the University of Saskatchewan, and my fellow SIG members. The information age threats, we've all seen this before. I don't need to read them, but there's a lot of threats to conducting business in the information age. If you just break down the first one, malware, there's threats within threats: virus, worms, Trojan horses, rootkits, backdoors. The previous talk, George was talking about cultivating an awareness of the risk culture. And that was one of the messages that resonated with me. It's my experience as a CISO that people frequently underestimate the risk, and they frequently overestimate trust. And so fundamentally, risk and trust are related discussions. If we're going to talk about the risk involved with conducting business in the information age, we have to have a similar discussion about trust. So what is the big deal with trust? We're going to talk about trust, digital identity, federations, services, trust, and collaborations, and I'm hoping that we'll actually have dialogue after we're done speaking to the audience, that we can actually have some feedback about what people are thinking. We're going to look at where we are now, meaning at a national level, and we're going to ask the question, where should we be heading? I think right now there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions about where we should be heading, but I don't think that there's agreement yet. I think we're all thinking similar thoughts, but I think we actually have to sit down and come to conclusions in a clear manner that provides some national direction. This is a non-technical talk, so there's some non-technical definitions. What is risk? It's an event or action which would harm our information or information systems. Trust, it's a firm belief in the reliability, integrity, strength of our information systems. Assurance, it's a positive declaration intended to give confidence. How can we be sure that a system that we're using is trusted? Even though it's a non-technical talk, there are some technical things that will be talked about, so we have to define them too. If you hear me talk about a key, it's just a mathematical object which determines the outcome of a cryptographic process. It's the thing that actually locks or unlocks. Asymmetric keys, it's the use of two keys, one to lock, one to unlock. Digital certificate, it's a collection of electronic attributes which establish the digital identity or other credentials. Public key infrastructure, it's the infrastructure which provides a common cryptographic basis for services that rely on trust, and a certificate authority issues and verifies digital certificates. So that's probably the most technical we're going to get. So consider the typical transaction in the information age. How many people here do online banking? Okay, so you go to the royalbank.com or TD Canada Trust, and you type in your username and password, and there's a couple of issues of trust that you've already just presupposed. First of all, you suppose that the transaction that you're telling the bank to do on your behalf is kept secret between you and the bank, and you also trust that you're actually talking to the bank, not some intermediary who's got nefarious purposes. So what is the basis for you presupposing that trust? Unbeknownst to you, or maybe for the more technically savvy, you've noticed that the bank has redirected you to HTTPS rather than HTTP. Do you actually confirm that? Has anyone actually ever confirmed that the bank has done that, redirected you to a secure? So there's a few. I'm sure, I'm not going to ask the opposite question. Who has not done that? Okay. So look at this transaction though. You're using your own system at home, which you trust because it's yours. The bank doesn't control both ends, and yet you're willing to enact this transaction, and there is this presupposition of trust. So how can the bank convey to you that there's some kind of trustworthiness in this transaction? And have you ever thought about the difference between actually safeguarding the transaction itself and simply having the bank assert its trustworthiness to you? We just take this stuff for granted. Another information age transaction, more in line with the research community. University research groups provide services, shared data. They use their own research systems, typically not controlled by the university centrally because they're externally funded by a granting agency. No one entity controls both ends. Think of a scenario where you've got researchers working in different universities. And again, there's this presupposition of trust between researchers, and the problems are fundamentally the same. And again, there's a difference between ensuring that the transactions that occur between these researchers are kept secret, or the integrity is kept intact. And there's still the issue of how does one researcher fundamentally identify themselves in a trustworthy way to the other researcher. But more common variation is the trustworthiness of email. This, again, it's the same problem. Universities provide email services. Researchers use the university's email systems, fundamentally trusting them. No one university controls both ends of that process, and yet we presuppose that the information we receive by way of email is trusted. Have we taken steps to safeguard that process in a trustable way? There's actually protocols out there that have been out there for ages, I'm talking about S-MIME, that could establish this basis of trust, yet we don't push our universities to use that protocol, for example, and in fact, we don't have the architecture to do it. So it's the same thing. Here, one researcher is saying, transfer $10 million from the trading account into the special effects trust before the opening business day. If you got an email like that, how many people would question it? Hopefully some of you, but the point is, the point is that it begs the question, what's our basis for trust? These are typical security concerns, being the established or the preservation of secrecy, the integrity of the transaction, the accessibility to service, authenticity, and non-repudiation. These are typical security concerns. If we analyze this transaction, we notice that the parties engaged don't necessarily know each other. Like, certainly we have research relationships today where the researchers don't know each other. Their names go on collaborative grants. They may know each other by reputation. So if you receive an email from someone you know by reputation, how do you know it's really that person sending the email? I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating it simply to prove the point, but the fact is that this represents risk in our environments. Threats can be launched against the research or the institution by attacking the method by which we enact these transactions. In the information age, participants interact beyond their local security domain. So if you think about your digital reputation in a university environment, your digital reputation is defined by probably your email domain. We certainly see people concerned about changes to the email system because academic researchers have built up their reputation. So if you think about transaction between trust domains, often it represents different universities. Traditionally, common digital identity is required. Without pre-existing relationships, trust must be established somehow. But I guess at the point I'm going to keep banging away at this is we haven't really validated how we actually establish these trust relationships in a technical sense. Access control policies, granting of access to resources. People often just simply suppose this to be a foregone thing, that they can share resources between trust domains without having to work through these things. Digital identity. Okay, so I'm going to go on a tangent here. I want to establish the fact that there's a relationship between digital identity and trust. So Microsoft and Google are fighting over your identity. I looked at these stats in 2009, and at the time, Google was spending $1 billion a quarter, $4 billion a year. In 2012, Google spent $4 billion a quarter to get your digital identity. They're building infrastructure to have your Gmail account, to have your Google Plus account. Their income, above revenue in 2011 was $11.7 billion. That was 31% of the revenue. In 2012, it was $12.7 billion. And the income to date in 2013 is $3.75 billion, and that's just the start of the year. The business world has realized something that I believe universities haven't, and that's that your identity online is valuable. We talk about outsourcing our email systems to third-party providers. We take for granted the fact that your UWO or your University of Saskatchewan identity has value. The corporate world is spending massive amounts of money on your identity. Why? Is it because your identity is valuable? It's because your trust is valuable, and that's where they're making their money. So I would suggest this. It's got implications for the education world. If outside companies see value in digital community and trust and are heavily investing to obtain access, so should we as research institutions if we're going to remain relevant in the information age. Investment in digital identity, both the enterprise identity and the identity of people in our community, pays dividends. So universities who fail to realize this will fail to compete in the information age. Hopefully, this will establish that there's a relationship between your identity and how we develop trust. This quote came from the Information Security Governance and Risk Management Conference held in Las Vegas last year. One of the biggest stumbling blocks for organizations wishing to participate securely in the information age is that a framework of trust is not realized before setting out. What this suggests with respect to the Canadian research community in higher education is that a national public key infrastructure, which is I'll translate that into normal English, a common basis for our trust has to be established, and a certificate authority must exist to establish the basis for this trust. So, digital credentials and trust. If we talk about projects like the Canadian Access Federation, they're doing wonderful work. They're federating these local security domains. Yeah, and yay, I'm cheering that on. But there's a further discussion to be had, and that is this, is that as part of their efforts, we have to incorporate the basis for trust, the inclusion of X509 certificates and that kind of thing. I think I'm asking some questions here. Are there vehicles for carrying out trust at a national level? Do we contain attributes of credentialed owners in a national way? I mean, technically this is all doable, but we still have to have that baseline discussion. We have to level set some of our expectations. And of course, integrating digital trust into digital identity. These things must be verifiable, unforgeable, typical security stuff, and there has to be standards, such as the adoption of the X509 standard. So what's the solution here? Hopefully people have bought into the idea that the only way we're going to start to have conversations about trust at a national level is to build the infrastructure. Is this something that we can't do because we're diverse, we have many competing interests? Are we trying to fit a square peg in a round hole? Hopefully not. Digital identities define the local security domains. We've already got that. Most universities have an identity. No, I think I've already done that one. So let's look what's happening in the global space in the research community. Australia has national standards. They have information, for example, this isn't comprehensive. Information technology, publicly authentication framework. There's the standard reference number. That governs certificate revocation. So they've had a discussion at a national level that's starting to address these things. They also have OSCERT, which is a national effort to provide a basis for trust in the research area. United States has standards too, National Institute of Standards and Technology. Their interests are beyond the EDU domain, it's true, but they do have standards that apply. Federal digital signature standards, for example. They have Internet 2, which is provision of common services to the internet community, and they have InCommon specifically. And some people here have probably heard of InCommon. Malaysia had a national effort, not just the EDU domain, it included the EDU domain, but they adopted commercial standards and worked with vendors to roll out PKI at a national level. Every citizen of Malaysia, 12 and up, possesses an identity card that incorporates in digital identity. That's a very impressive effort, I think, by a government. And of course, they've recently grown that beyond simply Malaysia, and they've included Brunei. Europe has European electronic signature standards. They have a working group on information security. They have certificate profile standards, advanced electronic signatures, and they have, again, a PKI and a certificate authority that services just the EDU community. That's trina.org. So what's happening in Canada? I've surveyed, I got a list from CUCCIO of 72 Canadian universities, and I reached out to them, and 29 of them responded by emails, and I asked them questions. 100% of Canadian universities are using certificates. So far, I've not found any exceptions, and that's technically proven. I took all of the universities that I was given, and I technically tested to see if they were using certificates, at least to validate their web identity. Haven't found a university that isn't using certificates. 29 universities responded my email saying that they purchased 2,877 certificates at a cost of, aggregated cost of $300,000. That's a pretty big investment in trust. When we tested the EDU domain, however, for certificate usage, we found another 5,800 more. So they're reporting that they're using 2,800, but they're actually using 8,715. So that represents that essentially universities know they're using certificates, but there's faculties and departments within universities that are also using certificates. Now I have to say certificates are useful for many things. This I'm talking about is just the web presence, justifying your identity on the web. If you have certificates used for example, authentication, I haven't included any of that. And this doesn't include the 43 universities who didn't respond to my requests. So if we calculate the average certificate cost based on budgets reported by the 29 universities, the average certificate cost is $104. If we calculate the cost of deploying 8,700 certificates, that's just under $1 million. Now, I have to disclaim this by saying, yes, that estimation is high. Yes, there are self-signed certificates in there. Nevertheless, it represents the scope to certificate usage. It's something we just simply take for granted, and I don't think we should be taking it for granted. I think we should be having discussions about this. There are no standards in yet within the EDU domain. There may be discussions at the national level in their shared services, but I'm not privy to that. Security groups are looking at this. I've had discussions with CANARIE. I've had discussions with CUCCIO about this, and we have discussions about this all the time in the security SIG. There are no national PKI for the EDU domain as an EDU domain, no vendor agreement for certificate purchase. However, Grid Canada has a national PKI, but it's privately undersigned, so it could technically meet the need for establishing the basis of trust. Right now, it's isolated to the Grid community, and as I said, it's not undersigned by a vendor. CANARIE is aware of the problem and is looking at possible partnership agreements with Internet 2. So what are the challenges? We have the typical challenges of centralization versus decentralization. If we are suggesting that we have to get our heads together to work out a national strategy for trust, isn't that a chicken and the egg problem? Have we really established within our university environment how diverse groups, faculties, and departments deal with this issue? I mean, do we have to solve it internally before we solve it nationally, or do we do it the other way around, hoping that solving it nationally will force us to solve it internally? It's the same typical problems that challenge universities. There's intra-university policy and national strategies, federal versus provincial jurisdiction. Australia has the advantage that education is a national thing. In Canada, it's a provincial thing. So we have those boundaries that we have to somehow get beyond. There's dialogue between university CIOs, CISO security directors, dialogue with partner institutions such as CANARIE, Grid Canada, and the research community itself. We have to have, I think we have to have this dialogue, and it has to be transparent. We have to cultivate agreement on strategies such as do we stage an evolution towards a national PKI to support not only university enterprise but also the research community? Is there got to be a difference? How do we coordinate certificate purchases? That might be the low-lying apple. I've spoken to vendors, and the vendors have said two things that I think are interesting from the financial perspective. They said we can probably detach certificate usage from per certificate cost. So they're saying, you know, if universities pay a membership fee, they can generate as many certificates as they want. Right now, all of the 29 universities that replied back to me said that that was the single largest problem with trying to deploy certificates, for example, was the per certificate cost. So if we could make that problem go away, that would be great. And 90% is a pretty good saving if we can actually realize that. Who manages a nationally deployed certificate authority, for example? These are questions that have to be addressed. Can we evolve Grid Canada's PKI to serve a broader community? That's probably a discussion CANARIE would be interested in. Adoption of Internet 2 model with help from CANARIE is certainly an interesting evolution. Is that the right strategy for the research community? I mean, it's a possibility, it's an option, it's a solution, but is it the solution that we should be pursuing? I have to call out Chris Phillips and Harry Sharma from CANARIE for having these dialogues with our group. Laurie McMillan and Art Exner from CUCCIO support our efforts, and the Security SIG members here.
So I want to propose one of the fundamental questions that have to be answered here. We spend about $1 million a year on certificates. A question, how many of you have ever looked at the certificate policy on that certificate when you go to your bank to see how much they're indemnifying you in case of loss? You know, most banks, it's only $250. I've had my colleagues say they buy the cheapest certificates possible to protect their electronic communications and digital signature at the university. In some cases, they're only buying $50 worth of protection. They're not staffing it to the corporate council for the understanding that they're actually putting significant university resources at risk. So this morning, I want to challenge us to take this issue about how much assurance do we put into these virtual representations that we inherently are trusting. Get my remote control here. So really, the quick objective I want to cover here is a better understanding the level of assurance in this web of trust. And this is where assurance and trust, some people say, well, they mean the same things. No, this is how strong that trust is. And really to challenge you to understand what's the desired minimal level of trust that will serve the higher educational institutions in Canada. So I even put this confusion that sometimes is called trust, but I like looking at an identity assurance. And that's the confidence that the asserted identity that's presented is valid. Fortunately, I've been in security for almost 30 years. I can remember going to conferences here. We'd go into a room, we're all using pretty good privacy, and before you could put your key on the key ring, you had to have two people who were already on the key ring to vouch for you. And that's how we did this transit trust to make sure you joined the community. Yesterday, transit trust was covered very well. So I mean, that's the type of thing that we're talking about. We're now talking about moving it to a level of confidence that we know that that virtual representation is there. There's also another term here, and this is the only legalese I'll try to stay away for, is relying parties. It's not just Jeff and I who are secure communicating. It could be the university or a third party that's relying upon the fact that we have an established trust relationship. So when you go to procure any type of certificate, you really have to understand who's relying on the transaction, who is trusting that digitally asserted identity is correct, and the actual interchange between the two parties is valid. It's a very interesting legal concept we find ourselves into. Similarly, we now have to bring up the policies and procedure role. And this is really where, for a lot of IT and IT governance folk, this is where it gets difficult. I mentioned earlier how many people had read what's called the Certificate policy that comes along with that $50 certificate they just bought. Not many, some do. We have to decide a policy that would apply to the universities in Canada. And then the next one is really important, and that's that certificate practice statement that says, how did Lawrence get that certificate that says he's from the University of Saskatchewan? Like when I showed up here, it was great. I flipped open my Surface. It's got EduRoam on it, and the University of Ottawa trusted that identity that I was asserting from Saskatchewan. Does the University of Ottawa really understand how the University of Saskatchewan granted me that ID to allow them trusted access to their wireless network? You get into a very interesting discussion when you start thinking about that. The amount of alcohol that's been consumed definitely affects how paranoid you get or whether or not you think it's a great idea. The certificate policy really covers off these issues. And how are users authenticated during enrollment? How many folks here, before they give any member of faculty, student, or staff someone to check a piece of national ID before that identity is given out? How many do that? 1, 2. So you see it's starting. There are some schools that it's given before they're even accepted, and they could actually retire with it at the end of their career, and it's never been validated. There's tons of legal issues with that in terms of liability and permitted use. What's the purpose of the certificate? You know, is it being used for secure file transfer, secure issues? Private key management, that gets into the public and private key pairs. I won't go down there. Escrow, if you've been around a long time, that's when you store the private key. So if you ever get into, as I went through at Nortel, one of the senior folks did proverbially get hit by the bus, and we did have their key escrow. We could actually go in and assume their ID and recover the data they had. If we weren't able to do that, we would have lost a tremendous amount of data and work. What are other requirements? How do you enroll? And how long are the pairs valid for? That's in the policy. The practice statement really takes us into how it's done. And looking at a time here, I want to make sure that we have good time for discussion. I'll leave that up for a few seconds to scan. But this is really how things are done. Like, what's the naming scheme? A national naming scheme for the CAs in Canada. I look at these potential vendors. They're all in the US, and with all that's in the press right now, I'm not too sure I really want my Canadian ID to be held by an American institution. How this is all put together, certificate lifetime. How do you revoke it? You lay somebody off, someone resigns. How do you revoke their virtual identity in such a manner that it's fair to them and to the university? You think email for life is an issue? Not, it even gets worse when you couple in the virtual identity. And I put up here some assurance examples. Most of us, by the way, are actually running at the rudimentary level in our certificates. No identity proofing is required. Sorry, I've got 2 folks back there that have done some basic identity proofing. But the rest of them are build on that, you know, basic. The claimant has to prove that he or she controls the token or certificate. Password or PINs are permitted. Then medium, you get into cryptographic, 2-factor authentication. How many folks have implemented a 2-factor authentication scheme for certain types of online transactions? The U of S has, you know, so we have a few. And then, of course, there's a very high confidence 2-factor token, strong cryptography, and probably biometrics. You go into a 3-factor system. And the whole idea here that the assurance is picked to match what's at risk. Now, I haven't covered that particular example off, which is very important. But not to get into too much a detailed technical issue, I really wanted to take a few minutes. How are we doing for time? Good? Yeah. Good. In this web of trust, this kind of puts into place who is at play. We have proverbial Bob. It's usually Bob and Jane when you're talking PKI. The CA, the central authority that's put together, certificate authority that's put together, actually has an accepted cryptographic trust. I think we've all seen the errors in our browsers when you open a website and says, we don't trust that key. How many people just say okay and ignore it? You don't have to answer that. Which Bob then takes Bob's name, using the CA, it's digitally signed, and that produces a certificate. So really what a certificate is an attestation of Bob with his digital ID that a third party, the certificate authority, has cryptographically bound to next 509 public key, private key pair. And that so it becomes Bob's virtual representation. And Bob then has trust from the certificate. Bob then can go and sign a document by using his private key. That means anyone that can access his public key from the certificate authority, so first of all, they know it's Bob's public key because it's a certificate authority, and that means they can have a very strong assurance that Bob did indeed sign the document. This allows third parties that open this document to actually validate that Bob did sign it. So this is a very brief description of this process. And we also get third parties. This web of trust, this very quick description of this, really shows that establishing the CA with those certificate policies and certificate practices establishes how much assurance that we have in Bob's virtual representation. And the third parties that trust that then know that it was Bob. I'm giving here something that normally takes a lot longer to go through, but I think you start to understand why us answering that very important question, how much assurance do we start to need in two things? A virtual identity that's attested by our relative institutions. So when I email another researcher on a subject regarding information security, they have a reasonable degree of assurance that I'm actually Lawrence, I'm actually from U of F. And they can validate that. Or they can do file transfers the same way, securely. Or they can collaborate on research. At that point in its research cycle, could still be in that magical state where the decision to patent or publish or even trade secret has not been yet made. And it also can assure myself that I've got no third-party big brother actually looking at that conversation taking place. And that leads us to the final thing that I want to get into the final minutes, is something about cross-certification. And this is kind of the mess that I'm hoping we're going to evolve. If we're not careful and we have each of our universities standing up their own certificate authority, and we're starting to see that happen because of the cost of CAs, if I want to send something to the University of Western Ontario, University of Saskatchewan, we're going to have to somehow mutually get our CAs to talk and reach agreement on things. I really don't want to do that 47, and ran this 47 times. If I look at the interest group across Canada, I hope there would be one central CA that would represent all the universities in Canada, that would articulate out the master certificate authority and certificate practice state. Hopefully they could cross-certify with the Tri-Council, because it's going to come from them, with the government of Canada and their industrial partners. And then we could go to Australia and do the same thing, and with the .eu domain. This just demonstrates how all these assurance things flow. You know, we've got low assurance CAs that are trusted by their own assurance CA, but unfortunately, the low assurance CA can only trust the high assurance CA. The high assurance CA can't trust the low assurance CA. So when this web is put together, this ends up becoming a very, very good argument of why the idea of doing this centrally, and rather than allowing a fragmented environment to develop where everyone has their own different view of assurance, how much trust they put into a system, what their policies and procedures are. So this comes down to what I consider the challenges. What level of trust, and I probably should have struck that out and put assurance, do we need for secure email between our institutions? What level of trust do we need for secure file transfer? And then for generic secure communications, we're all moving to VoIP. Has anyone even thought about media security on VoIP? No. And then for contractual obligations. Oh, I'm going to partner with another researcher on his grant. He's going to transfer money back and forth. So we have to set up a research partnership. We've got ethical approval processes. Oh, the research we're doing is involving victims of sexual abuse, and we're sharing their medical history files as we develop our papers and publish. Do I have any contractual, regulatory, and other obligations that I have to fulfill? It's an ideal opportunity, I think, for us as a national group of educators to put together a centralized system that provides that web of trust and assurance across the country.
So if we could just invite discussion, comments, or really anything, because as I said, the goal here was to initiate dialogue, to identify people who have an interest in this, and hopefully get some feedback.
Some people say that the certificate model itself is fundamentally broken because the average graduate takes 607 CAs are certified, and some of them have screwed up quite badly, and that's causing issues. Do you think what you're proposing is a step away from or improvement from the model?
Well, first I want to tip my hat to Peter's comments yesterday. There's no such thing as perfect security. The fundamental problem that a certificate authority solves is, can we do things securely? If you think about self-signed certificate, yeah, they're a hassle. They put up these nag things, but they do actually secure transport layer. So the question is, the fact that there are problems in managing certificate authorities, does that mean we shouldn't employ them? And I think clearly the answer is yes, we should employ them, but address the problems that make them not work well. So when we talk about establishing a national CA, for example, that would be like saying, as universities, we're going to come together and we're going to trust this entity, but then we have to ask the question, how is this entity to be managed? And that's a separate issue. Like I think we'd be throwing the baby out with the bathwater to avoid going in that direction simply because there are challenges in that direction.
I certainly applaud your interest in developing the national CA policy and practice. I just wonder, though, places like Internet 2 decided not to go with their own CA. Many of the countries in Europe are not going with their own CA. Australia found that managing their own CA was a real headache. Do you think we need a Canadian CA or?
Well, I'm not actually posing a particular solution. Managing our own CA is one opportunity. In the US case, they're partnered with a vendor who undersigns their trust, and their vendor provides very good service. They provide a national method by which they can issue different universities the ability to issue their own certificates. So they're a vendor agreement. In the US case, it's in common. I think that's yet another option. I think we've identified a number of options. We could run our own CA. We could partner with a vendor to run our own CA. There's pros and cons. We could try to take a national CA such as Grid Canada's CA and evolve it such that it's doing more than it's doing now. And at our level, at the level of CISOs, we just want the infrastructure, and we think that there are other principles above us that should be looking at those issues. And I suggest the CIOs and CANARIE, for example.
I want to add to that. One of the things that is very important, we have to have a CA that meets Canadian law. Whether that's delivered by a cloud service provider, by a particular university stepping up, by a national group, you pick. That's a fallout, I believe, of understanding the business requirement of the assurance level we require. And then we allow that to drive it.
Okay, good. Supplementary on that. There are at least 4 provinces in Canada looking at certificate authorities or a trust framework for their government and extending it to at least primary and secondary education. Do we see an opportunity in that area?
Well, see, that's a good observation too. If that's the case, then what has to happen is universities have to get a seat at the table so they can influence the process. And right now, I'm not convinced necessarily that this particular service, at least, is on the radar at a national level. Like, we're still trying to work through how to get these enterprise services nationally. But if there are examples of provinces, for example, that are working through these issues, it would be great to actually put it on our EDU radar and get someone at the table to represent our interests in those discussions. Chris, at the back.
Thank you very much for being able to do a great job of capturing what the ecosystem has with the certificate space out there. It's been a very difficult task over the last couple of years to try to catalog that and really articulate the business need, showing that there's somewhere, what, $300,000 to $900,000 to spend out there on just server-side certificates. There's a huge opportunity. So one of the things that the Canadian Access Federation and CANARIE have been talking about with the CIO advisory group is the interest in them pulling the trigger on adopting that CA, that bulk buying or that bulk signing authority. And we would encourage you in the audience here and whoever else to advocate to your CIO and say that's something that you want. Because we don't want to pull the trigger without seeing the demonstrated need. And I think you've done a great job in capturing what the cost is out there. And the savings are dramatic. The other thing is I think that you mentioned about Grid Canada and certificate authorities. And so certificate authority stuff in the Grid Canada side of things, CANARIE is looking at pulling in advanced stages and pulling in Grid Canada back into CANARIE. Because right now it's under the NRC Shared Services branch, and it's not the best home for it. It's been out there in the NRC, the National Research Council, which has involved that arm of the operators, has moved into shared services. And so their mandate is not in line necessarily with what the Grid Canada role is playing, especially for Westgrid. And the other thing about Grid Canada, it's not about standing up a CA, it's about who trusts you. So Grid Canada is one of the only recognized Canadian trust anchors for researchers to the rest of the grid community internationally. So I think we see the need to have that grid part and the CA part there, and we also see the need for the commercial side of things and the economies that we can bring to it and centralize. So you guys have done a great job on capturing the need, especially in the second part of the presentation, rolling out those how much trust we need and how much you balance off the effort and risk. So thanks, and I would advocate that talk to your CIO and look forward to the conversation.
Just two quick questions about Chris's comments. Chris is uniquely positioned to have an opinion on this because he was instrumental in helping stand up the Canadian Access Federation, and it was actually the business case that drove us. Like, I would like to use certificates to authenticate people on my network, but I can't because every certificate costs me $104. And certificate vendors are telling guys like Chris, we can get rid of that problem if we can work with you to design a different business model. I would love to use as many certificates as I can generate without having to pay for every one, and that's one of the benefits that would come out of this discussion. Jason, you had your hand up?
No, I'm just going to be the devil's advocate, and I really think you need to do more in really proving that the level of assurance is really required. When we think about trust and identity and have you, like at my institution, we don't even have employee ID cards. So if I don't have, if there's no way of validating physically that you're a member of the university, then why does it matter electronically? And what's really at stake for the researcher? I mean, vast majority, like I said, I'm being devil's advocate. A majority of the researchers, like, they're gonna want their stuff published. I mean, there's, you gotta really prove to the researcher, and I mean, I know there's a few who, yeah, it matters because they're gonna have contractual obligations. That's really what's driving them in a lot of ways to do this stuff. And I think that message has to be clear before we even start talking about it.
I'll tell you what's at risk for the researcher: loss of research grants. CIUCCIO, the Canadian Institute of Health Information, is now looking for the security officers of each university to sign off the safeguarding, or they do not get access to the big data that CIUCCIO has. I'm hearing rumors, and other members of the CUCCIO group are very, very concerned that the Tri-Council is going to hit us with similar requirements. We're moving to an open publication basis. But the idea is now to make sure that before the decision to publish patent or trade secret is done, it is safeguarded. Just for disclosure's sake, I'm also a researcher, so I'm very, very concerned about this. But I think the reality of having that autonomy in the digital connected world is going to vanish. They're going to have. I'm amazed that universities don't have better physical identity. Unfortunately, I'll have to pick out a tragedy to show how that changes. You talk to anyone at Virginia Tech, what happened? You talk to anyone that's been unfortunate enough to have a significant compromise on campus. And it's not when, it's if. So it's one of these, like the old Fram oil commercial, you can pay us now or pay us later. It's coming.
Yeah. Okay, we're out of time now. I'm wondering if there should be a box set up on this, because I think we could have gone on with questions for like an hour. So I don't know if somebody wants to, people think so, maybe just write it up on the board or something. And
Peter, we don't have to be out of time, right? Because there's a break right now.
there's a break now, yeah. Except the hungry people will feel guilty if they leave.
Good job, man.
Hey Jeff, good job. Mary Sharma. I don't think we ever met face to face.
Yeah, Hera, yeah, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Put a face to a name.
Exactly. And it was nice to hear Chris talk about some of the things we can do, so let's chat more.
Yeah, for sure.
Good job.
Thanks.